We start with introduction. We just have a short clip by Tawfiq Al.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم صدق الله العظيم والسلام.
So, inshallah, today we have gathered here Yaqeen Sikander, who is coming from Kashmir and originally has started all the way from Turkey. So he is pioneering a new field of Islamic psychology, one of the first few in the cadres of the field. Inshallah, is going to introduce us to the topic and what the reason why we have chosen this topic is to understand what is Islamic psychology, why is it going to be critical for us in practice. So our main target audience here are practitioners, including doctors and psychotherapists. So they're twofold. One is to understand what is the role of a clinician, how he is going to engage with the specialty, when is he going to refer patients to the specialty. The second is as well as train the younger cadre in this new upcoming specialty. What are they going to learn? How are they going to intervene? What are they going to be useful? And this is our aim of the gathering today, and hopefully after this we'll all be more inclined towards engaging in a new field like this. Without much ado, I'll call brothers Yaqeen start.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Everybody can hear me loud and clear? Perfect. These are all the faces I saw in the previous programs and some of you are new. Before as well, how many of you are here for the first time? Lovely, mashallah. Thank you so much for joining and for joining us for a really important topic, because the topic of Islamic psychology is something that has lately received a lot of attention. Because research and studies found that Muslims need specialized care which naturally reflects their own values. Because no matter what, a Muslim being practicing or not, a lot of the things we do in our culture has something to do with Islam. And that's why if we talk about holistic care, and we are talking about health care that is holistic, there is a strong need to incorporate the values and the teachings and the worldview of Islam. And that's why we're here today to talk about an introduction to Islamic psychology. What is Islamic psychology? We're going to talk about it. Why do we need Islamic psychology? We're going to talk about that. And what is the role of the practitioner? And what are some of the things that we can incorporate if we are being practitioners of Islamic psychology? To go on with one of the sayings of Imam Ghazali, and it's a very famous saying that he mentions in Ihya Ulumuddin is Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. One who knows himself knows his Lord. And this is important. It's important because Ghazali mentions the most intimate knowledge one can have is self-knowledge. Because whoever is ignorant of himself is more ignorant of everything else. So look at the holistic perspective that how we need as practitioners to also look within ourselves, even and have that self-knowledge and insight. Not just to know our clients, but also to know God, to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why self-knowledge to begin with is a very essential part of Islamic psychology. That the more we know ourselves, the more we'll be able to deliver good patient outcomes, thereby not only good clinical outcomes, but also be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, just as an icebreaker, what comes to mind, or what are some of the things that come to mind when you hear Islamic psychology?
More of positive psychology, gratitude, forgiveness, hope.
All right. So, more of positive psychology, gratitude, hope, thankfulness, those attributes. Anyone else? What comes to mind when you hear Islamic psychology? What bells does it ring in your mind? Anything else? Positive psychology. We're going to address that part. Spirituality. That's another one that comes to mind. Spirituality. Is belief. All right. Anything else that comes to mind with Islamic psychology?
How you can master detachment. How you can master detachment.
How we can master
Detachment.
detachment. Right. How can we master detachment? That's an important aspect of the spiritual part as well as the Islamic psychology. Beautiful. These are all beautiful perspectives. And let's go back a little bit. When we talk about Islamic psychology, it has always been embedded into Islamic sciences from the classical times. But the only difference that we see is this. When we talk about Islam classically, many of the fields, for instance, philosophy, psychology, physiology, they were actually considered part of the mainstream Islamic theology itself because the religious and secular knowledge was not separate. There was no dichotomy there, which is why even though we have a lot of resources of what we now call as Islamic psychology, at that time it was called ilm-nafs in Arabic, right? The knowledge of the nafs. But we don't categorically see it as Islamic psychology. And there is a reason for that, why that happened. And that has something to do with power discourse. If I say psychology as a science today, what comes to mind? Just psychology. Freud, Jung, right? All the other contributions like mental health conditions, DSM, ICD. And the reason for that is because right now the dominant discourse is the Western discourse. That's why when we say psychology, we automatically assume modern Western secular psychology. So similarly, when we look classically in the Islamic texts, Islamic psychology was not a separate branch because when you mention psychology, automatically meant Islamic psychology because there was no dichotomy between secular sciences or religious sciences. And some of the examples that I mentioned here, and I'm trying to do it by the timeline, is Al-Razi writing the book Al-Hawi, which is a comprehensive book where he talks a lot about human nature and psychology. Even Biscawi wrote Taqib al-Akhlaq, or the refinement of character. Even Sina, Al-Khan the canon of medicine. Al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, and Al-Qayyim's Madarij al-Salikin. And these are just few examples of very, very classic texts that we find about human nature. So, the idea of psychology or positive psychology is actually not something alien, or it's not something new for Muslims. It has always been there. And the question of why we have to use the term Islamic psychology is because of the power discourse. We want to distinguish it from modern psychology. Inshallah, I hope time comes again when we say psychology, we understand Islamic psychology, just as it used to be. So that is the idea of the discourse. And that's why right now we use Islamic psychology. The reason for being has to do with that discourse. Otherwise, our scholars have always written about mental health, and also from a very preventative approach. Because Islam does not see mental health just as pathology. It also sees mental health as promotion of well-being. And that's the basis of nafs, that it does not look. And I think until positive psychology, until the early 2000s, psychology would, pathologize human behavior. It would all be about the DSM and the mental health disorders. While as it was positive psychology that brought all these positive attributes into psychology that we see very recently happening in mainstream psychology. But when you read Muslim Islamic scholars classically, even back at 865 to 925 years, you will find Al-Razi in those times also writing about positive virtues and attributes, or things that we can do to actually improve our mental health. It could be through hope, through gratitude, and through many other forms, which are actually considered virtue in the traditional way. Now, if we have to look at the definition of Islamic psychology, what is Islamic psychology exactly? Islamic psychology can be called as ilm al-nafs. It's an emerging field of how to integrate Islamic teaching and contemporary psychological findings, right? So, how do we understand psyche and behavior through the lens of Islam and our spiritual tradition and values? Now, when we say Islamic psychology, it's an umbrella term, meaning to say that there are also different schools of thought in Islamic psychology. Okay, so the school of thought I tend to incline more towards is known as TIIP, traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy. Okay, so there is a general Islamically oriented psychotherapy that is more like you take the tradition of Islam and try to integrate it with psychology. Traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy, TIIP, that we're going to talk about today, is traditional in nature, which means the foundation is the Quran and the Sunnah, as well as writings of the early Muslim scholars. Okay, so that is specific to TIIP. And how do we define TIIP? And those of you who were in the training would know this. So TIIP is actually an integrated model of mental health care, which is grounded in the principles of Islam and the empirical truths in psychology. So there is an Islamic epistemology and an ontological framework where we discuss two things: the nature and composition of what it means to be human, human nature, what drives human nature, what is pathology in the Islamic tradition, right? And what are the mechanisms of change? We're going to look at that, as well as transcendent realities. Transcendent realities here mean that when we look at TIIP, we are also talking about hereafter. When we conceptualize human pathologies, human behaviors, or human nature from an Islamic perspective or from the perspective of TIIP, it's really essential to take afterlife into consideration. And that is the largest difference between secular psychology while compare that to Islamic psychology. We believe in the concept of the soul, we believe in the concept of the heart, the metaphorical heart that I mean, and how it can corrupt the soul, right? If the heart is corrupted, as well as that Allah created all of us together first as souls, and then He sends us to earth. We will die, but death is not considered the end, as it is in the secular psychology. We believe death is a new dawn. It's a beginning of the afterlife. So all of those variables are actually taken into consideration when it comes to Islamic psychology and TIIP. Now, one of the books that I would recommend for this is actually Dr. Kumar's book, but I don't know where it's not named. To you. Yeah, here it is. Applying Islamic principles to clinical mental health care, introducing traditional Islamic sector. So, this is the book which is very comprehensive and which will give you the whole idea of Islamic psychology, especially what the TIIP is all about, including the roles of the practitioner, case formulation, as well as the theoretical foundations of this school of thought. So this is a very essential text by Dr. Human and others who have written this book. So I just wanted to share that with you. And those of you who can actually find it somewhere. I'm not really certain if it's available in India, but let me ask Dr. Human, inshallah. And then based on that, we can see what we can do. Now, having said that, let's move on to the idea of how TIIP looks at the process of change, right? Because whenever we look at any modality in psychotherapy, the process or the mechanism of change is extremely important to be taken into consideration. That when you are doing therapy, how exactly do you conceptualize the change takes place in the person? How exactly does the person change from a maladaptive to a more adaptive behavior? And the answer of different modalities or school of thoughts is different. For example, CBT will tell you maladaptive thoughts and cognitive distortions lead to maladaptive behavior. So, what if we make the thoughts more adaptive? Our behavior would be more adaptive as well. Psychodynamics says that human beings have a lot of repressed desires. So the repression is the reason for what Freud called as the neurosis, which is like a collection of like syndromes that are there. So similarly, different theories and school of thoughts have different mechanisms of change. So when we talk about the process of change, when it comes to the Islamic psychology or TIIP, what are we looking at? We are looking for the first step is actually muraqabah, right? Or muraqabah, which is actually the alliance or therapeutic alliance. How is your relationship with your client? And by the way, this is not just in TIIP. Generally, every research and every practitioner believes that the most important part of the whole relationship with the person is actually how well can you connect with your client or your patients. Because if there is a problem with the first level of murabata or the alliance, the person would find it extremely difficult to reach the other stages. So the first step is always about knowing the person and be that is a very important part. So if you're practicing as a psychologist, be it here in Ummeed or anywhere else, remember that the first step that leads to any change, specifically in TIIP as well as any other modalities of psychotherapy, is how well are you able to meet the client where they are, meet the patients where they are, not where you are. It's important to speak their language. It's important to know their culture. It's important to understand why they do what they do. And it's important for them to understand the idea that I can open up to this person. It's a safe space. I will not be judged. And whatever I say will not be held against me. Right? That's the characteristic of a safe space. That it's not judgmental and whatever is said is not used against you. And whenever stories, narratives are told in safe spaces, the guilt, the shame, it starts going away. It's very important. How does society treat people with mental health conditions, especially addiction, right? Because we are also in the addiction center. We are always hell-bent upon criminalizing people who are addicts. And when we go to the studies, interestingly, and I think I was discussing this a few days back, that in 2018 I was in Lisbon, and Lisbon classically had a huge problem with drug addiction. So government created certain schemes and they created certain programs to rehabilitate these young people by providing them jobs, by coming up with different kind of activities for the young people to be engaged. Right? So as a result of that, the huge epidemic of drug addiction in Lisbon, it was just over. And one of the experiments which was done, especially when it comes to addiction, was done like this. They were hamsters, right? Psychologists, we tend to use a lot of hamsters. How many of you have used hamsters in your learning, psychology, or psychology of learning? Haven't? Oh, in psychology of learning, it's very important to use hamsters. So we would use them like doing a maze, and you give them those pallets, like schedules of reinforcement, and they would pick them up and figure out their way in the maze. It's something very common. So they get these hamsters, a lot of them, put them in a cage, they give them food, and they give them water. But in the water, there is a drug which makes them high. Okay? So they are eating these, and they are drinking this water, and they are really getting high. All hamsters, they just love it, eating and getting high. That's it. But what they do then is there's another group they do this experiment with, another group of hamsters. But here, in this case, the area is bigger. The hamsters are there, and the food pallets are there. But there's also the hamsters feel, have fun. There are also those swings. There are also other ways where hamsters can go around these swings and play around and have fun, and while they can eat. But guess what? When it comes to water, they again put the same water to the drug straight line. Guess what? Most of the hamsters will actually not get high. They will actually be involved in doing other activities, even though the water was available, which if they drink that will make them high. So that gave a very different perspective of addiction. That addiction is actually not really addiction, it's actually lack of connection with others. It's also lack of connection with the bigger environment, what we call as engagement. If our youngsters are not engaged with what is good, we start thinking about what is bad. Like Imam Shafi said, keep your nafs engaged with what is good, or your nafs will keep you engaged with what is bad. So, you see how the perspective changes when we start looking at addiction in this manner. And why this is important? Because it's a part of the alliance, it's a part of murabata. That we don't judge the other person because we don't know their nature. And then, we have the uncovering part. In the uncovering part, there is the idea of imposition, where for the patient, they start introspecting and gaining this insight what's going on with them. And ultimately, the idea of the practitioner here is to bring that or equilibrium in the patient between their different values and pathologies, etc., and ultimately integrate that all together. And for the practitioner, alliances first, uncovering what's going on in the life of the patient, and then is the intervention, and ultimately it's having that connection and consolidating everything that has happened. And here there is an important aspect in TIIP. How do we define pathology when it comes to TIIP? Now, there is a pathology of clinical range, right? A person having severe depression or psychosis or any other mental health conditions. But in TIIP, there are spiritual pathologies as well. So, for example, what we call as diseases of heart, backbiting, right? Talking, not having husnuzan or always thinking negative about others. that is considered a part of spiritual pathology, right? So in the normal secular psychology, you will have clinical range of pathology, then you will have the normal range. But in terms of Islamic psychology or TIIP, we have spiritual pathologies as well. So it's not limited to what DSM calls as pathologies. It's also limited to the spiritual problems. Okay? And ultimately, we don't only want to be what we call as a normal range, there is also saintly rank. Saintly rank is when you are very high and very close to Allah by doing all the practices, you can actually achieve a saintly range in terms of the psychological function. And this is just an overview, I just wanted to give it to you. And I think in the previous part, we discussed a lot about it, that how fitra is the basis of our human nature, that Allah has created as pure. Our worldview, like psychologists believe that human beings are evil, and life is deterministic. We don't believe that as Muslims. We believe we have fitra, that Allah created us pure, but it's the environmental influences which turn us into what we are. And then we have different kinds of drives when it comes to human beings. We have an angelic drive, we have a hedonistic drive, we have satanic drive, and we also have aggressive drives. And then when we are talking about heart, qalb, in terms of Islamic psychology, we don't only mean the organ that pumps blood, it's actually metaphorical heart. When we say the heart does actions and the heart becomes hardened and the purification of the heart for physical nerves, it's a metaphorical heart also we are talking about. So when Ghazali or other early Muslim scholars talk about the purification of the heart, it's not the organ itself, it's the metaphorical heart which has connections. And that has the part of akal, ruh, ihsas, emotions, very important in TIIP, as well as nafs, which are our behavioral inclinations. And when it comes to the interventions, let's say whatever interventions we do after, let's say you finish your 2 levels of TIIP and you learn the interventions, either Islamic interventions or interventions that we can adapt to, which are other interventions, but we can adapt in other things. The ultimate idea of TIIP is what you call as qalb salim. That is the sound heart. Now, when we say we have to reach the equilibrium and we have to put everything together, the answer is this: when we return to Allah, we return with a sound heart. And that means it does not only include what happens in this life, it also includes what happens in the hereafter. So, as a TIIP practitioner, if there are things that might jeopardize the hereafter of your client, that's also taken into consideration. It's not only about pathologies which are happening here. Now the person has become functional and that's it. The dysfunctions here are also those dysfunctions which might actually have an effect on the afterlife of the person later on. So that's an important distinction. And when we ask this question, and this question is asked a lot, that why do we need an Islamic psychology, or why do we need TIIP? Because we talked about what it is, but why do we need it? And research actually tells us that whenever Muslims want to seek care, they want someone who understands their worldview and culture. And that includes one of the studies which was actually done by Weatherhead and Dykes in 2010. It's a very important study, which studied about what sort of therapist would Muslims like, what sort of characteristics must they have. And the answer predominantly was somebody who has an understanding of religion and psychotherapy, plus those who are very professional. So, 2 important things: knowing the integration of psychotherapy and religion, as well as another factor is professionalism. And let me tell you this as a Muslim myself. Our professionalism said that when a Muslim does something, he does it with excellence. Okay? So, sometimes we think our religion, unfortunately in our community we see this, that if I'm religious or my religiosity actually can compensate for me not being professional. that's very unfortunate. We see a lot of Muslims with a very minimal mindset. Like, bare minimum. I have to do it until here and that's it, I'll stay there. But our idea, the idea of our tradition is that we become best at what we do. You see, that's the most important idea when it comes to professionalism. It's not only knowledge, it's not only competency, it's also the idea that you give best to your profession. And let me give you an example of that. There are so many extremely rich people in the world. I mean, the world has never been richer than it is today. We have new billionaires coming every single day. Think of it like this. If people who have so much amount of money, so much amount of wealth, that they can live until many, many generations with that wealth, why do they need to work? Right? So it's not for the sake of money, it's the sense of responsibility you have. And the more better you are at something, the lesser time you will have. So yes, when we initially start doing anything, we have different drives, right? Oh, I'm passionate about this, I need the money, I want to be good at what I do. But then, imagine if you're a therapist, right? Initially, you have a full private practice, let's say, inshallah. You start making money, a good amount of money is coming up. But when people start realizing you're really good at what you do, more and more people start approaching and you will have less and less amount of time. And you might ask yourself, I have enough of the money, why do I do this? It's not about the money, it's about the sense of professionality and responsibility. Because if Allah has blessed you with knowledge, it would not be, it's actually prohibited not to share it with others, right? In Arabic, you call it mukallaf. Yeah? Mukallaf is from the word taklif, and human beings are mukallaf. We are responsible. We are really responsible. And responsibility means we follow through that responsibility. It doesn't only mean we are just responsible for a single thing, but we follow through that. So, if we are mukallaf, we are responsible before our Lord, know that out of responsibility we will have to do a lot of things. It's not only because, of other drives, but also the idea of professionalism here means we love what we do and we are excellent and the best at what we do. Okay? Now, if we look at classic Islamic scholars, the classic Islamic scholars have a general agreement about the importance of a practitioner. Okay? And by practitioner, I mean practitioner of nafsiyat, or you can say a TIIP practitioner, because now we are coming towards, after knowing what is Islamic psychology, why do we need it? Because Muslims are there and we have a worldview of our own. Our tradition is a living tradition, right? Our culture, our religion is a living religion. We embody it, we manifest it. And as such, we need interventions based on that. And then we are coming to the role of practitioner and why that is important. And if we look classically at what classic Muslim scholars have said, they always have talked about this idea of having a mentor or having a spiritual sheikh who can help you out, right? So when we look at it, I'll give you 3 examples here of what is, let's say, said by Imam Ghazali. Al-Ghazali makes the point that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for a slave, then He makes him aware of the deficiencies of his nafs. And then to acquire more idea or knowledge of the nafs, what can be done? The best one or the loftiest is to sit in front of a sheikh of tasawwuf and learn from the mashayikh. Okay? And whatever the sheikh will tell or is instructed, it is to train the nafs of that person. Okay? And some of the discoveries of your nafs will then occur apparently. It's explicit. While some will happen intrinsically that you wouldn't realize, and this is the noblest path. And the idea here of Al-Ghazali is you actually need somebody who can train your nafs. So in TIIP as well, it's very important when you become a practitioner, you have to train yourself in the values of Islam. It cannot be like secular psychology. My personal life or my personal character and values have nothing to do with my therapy practice. No, it's integrated. You definitely have something to do with that. Because who you are right now always has something to do with who you will become. Okay? And afterwards, if we talk about Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, he talks about an individual accepts from another more than he may accept admonishment from himself, isn't it? We are so good at giving advice to others, but when it comes to our own life, we are like, it's just not happening. So that's what al-Balkhi is saying. He says, oftentimes his judgment is impaired on the account of being overwhelmed by his passions and their intermingled one another. Because we cannot be objective about ourselves, isn't it? It's very hard to be very objective about ourselves. And that's why we have the idea of supervision and self-therapy. Because many of you who are studying psychotherapy or becoming therapists, in supervision, what is one of the ideas? Because it's not in India, but in other countries, you have to undergo intensive self-therapy before you become a therapist. You have to have that congruence with yourself. And one of the very important part is exactly, imagine when did al-Balkhi say this? SubhanAllah, this is hundreds of years ago. That how we are overwhelmed by our passions and our judgment is impaired. In other words, we are biased towards our own selves. So supervision and having the supervisor tells you is self-therapy. What you call as blind spots in modern therapy. Blind spots are things that you haven't paid attention to. But suddenly when you go to the supervision, you go to your supervisor through self-therapy, for instance, you get aware of that. I'm like this because I grew up like this. It's because of my culture. So sometimes we are not able to do that. And al-Balkhi had that idea so many hundreds of years ago, what we today call as self-therapy and supervision. Okay? And Al-Razi, if we refer to Al-Razi and what he says about the importance of Tabib al-Nafs, or the doctor of the Nafs, he talks about, on account of man's infatuation with self. Aren't we all infatuated with ourselves? That's a huge part of human nature. Approval and deeming of his actions to be commendable, as well as evaluation of his character and lifestyle through an overly rational perspective. It's not possible for anyone to subdue their passions. Resultantly, one is unable to recognize his own vices and blameworthy habits. And since he is not aware of these, he is unable to change it, let alone deem it inappropriate or work on it through. Modern psychology exactly tells you, if you read, for instance, if you want to be an analytical psychologist, you have to go through intense self-therapy. And the rationale is absolutely the same. That your own biases, you're not able to see them. And this is what classic Islamic scholars said. Imagine in the beginning when I talked about how there was no dichotomy in the Islamic world. So when we were talking about ilm al-nafs, these were the topics that were actually talked about the role. Okay? So therefore the person should rely in this matter on a wise man who is always his associate and companion, asking him to be informed about all the vices he knows of him and tell him that by this he will be doing what he likes and needs the most, and he will be most grateful and appreciative to him. This is exactly the role of a supervisor when you are becoming a therapist. Now, we do see that there is an overlap between the role of a sheikh and the role of a TIIP or an Islamic psychology practitioner. Why do both of these sort of like converge with each other? And the best way to look at it would be in TIIP, the proposed code. A mental health practitioner works on psychological functioning, and the spiritual practitioner or the sheikh works on spiritual functioning. That's very clear, right? But while we have psychological disorders, we also have diseases of heart that we talked about. Hasad or envy, jealousy, not having good opinion of others, husnism. That is all a part of the diseases of heart. And here, if we combine these disorders and diseases of heart, that's a more holistic perspective that TIIP wants to look at. Not only disorders and diseases of heart, but also positive characteristics of resilience, virtue, character, and relationships, right? We discussed this part. So, what distinguishes the Islamically integrated practitioner from the secular practitioner, right? The idea here is the idea of what we call as Rafiq. And Rafiq is the combination between two things. It's the combination between somebody who is well aware with the religious tradition as well as knows clinical science. So the combination of both, a tabib is a clinician or tabib al-nafs, and a Sufi sheikh, or there is a mystic guide, one who knows religion, but not only religion, religion which is oriented towards knowing the nafs. Because in Islamic tradition, there are also many different branches, right? You go to epistemology or kalam, you go to the sciences of the Quran, you go to the sciences of the hadith. It's a very well-structured area of study, which is our religion or deen. Here we are specifically talking about somebody who knows behavior and nature from the Islamic perspective, while has a very good hold of clinical sciences, and the combination of both will actually be someone, would be the role of someone who is a TIIP practitioner, right? And some of the characteristics, and this is based on Al-Ghazali, who talked about what kind of a person should the therapist be. Somebody who's upright in character. That means someone who's known to be good in character. And that's why when inshallah you do the TIIP certification, the 2 levels, the supervision, you also need the letter of good conduct, maybe from the imam of your mosque, maybe from the Muslim community that you work in, that you are a person who's known to be of a good character, of an upright character. So you cannot say I'm a TIIP practitioner and I'm in a therapy practice. Outside, I don't care what's going to happen. That is not going to work. So it's a holistic way of looking at that. And the idea is also of rifq or companionship. So there has to be more of an authoritative relationship here. And authoritative is different than authoritarian. Authoritarian is more dictatorial. Authoritative is more assertive relationship. And you have to be very assertive as a therapist when it comes to TIIP, because that's one of the mechanisms of change. Why does therapy work? Therapy works because therapist has more power than the client. And because therapist has more power, how does therapist have more power? Because they know about you way more than you know about the therapist, right? But that power is used to drive the change. So here the rifq or companionship doesn't mean the companionship of a friend. Because friends, you're on equal footage. One of you has to be higher in terms of knowledge, in terms of character, in terms of professionality. And then only it will lead to change. And the third one, Ghazali talks about strong foundation of knowledge in facilitating change. And we talked about that model and scholarship, which is very important. So ultimately, the way we look at it is a TIIP practitioner ultimately bridges and contains both aspects, a pure clinician and a spiritual mentor. If you just have to get the gist of it, a spiritual mentor, but a very professional clinician at the same time. But it does not mean you can replace one with the other. That you will say, I'm very good as a spiritual mentor, but clinically I'm not that good, or I'm not that competent. It doesn't work. Like I said, do not use the religiosity to compensate for professionalism. You have to be extremely professional as clinicians, like a pure clinician. You know what diagnosis and differential diagnoses are. You really know that what competencies do you need as a therapist. Apart from that, you are of a spiritual level where you can be a mentor to someone. And a mentor is more than a teacher. Teacher is generally someone who has more knowledge than you. And a mentor is someone who has more experience than you. Experience of life. It could be experience of protecting you from a possible harm. You know, that the path that you're walking, it might be dangerous, but the person knows because of their experience, so they protect you, and that is the idea of a spiritual mentor. So secular psychology overemphasizes empirical evidence all the time. So there is a very less appreciation of the metaphysical aspect. And in TIIP, we believe that a huge part of human beings, and in order to understand human beings, we need to understand our soul, we need to understand who we are. And the reality is not always what it is out there. We don't see the world as the world is. We see the world as we are. That's why Al-Ghazali says, one who knows himself knows his Lord. You know, the clarity comes based on that. And ultimately, there are this is an important part of the domains. Like, what is the domain of a tabib, which is a pure clinician? What is the domain of a Sufi sheikh? It's here. And what is the domain of a TIIP therapist? It is somewhere in the center. Okay? So, a clinician does not have religious authority. A sheikh has a religious authority. TIIP therapist is authoritative depending on their education. So you see, a clinician has a state licensure. If you are a sheikh, you need to have ijazat, and as a TIIP therapist, you need to have both. So you see, this is the idea of when we say that between a mentor and between being a pure clinician, there is that overlap. This is sort of the competencies that you are supposed to master. As a clinician, you only treat clinical problems, but as a TIIP therapist, you also treat spiritual problems, which includes virtue and character development. So at the same time, interventions, we use evidence-based behavioral science interventions as doctors. But in TIIP, there is evidence-based interventions, but you also use the interventions from spiritual tradition, which has supportive evidence. And supportive evidence here means we know that these work, and we have used them in some studies or with a sample of the people. Okay? And clinicians are secular in nature, whereas TIIP is more integrative. Alright? So these are just, I mean, you can look at the slide, me rather going through all of it. You can have a look at it that how, if you are being a TIIP therapist, you need to have foundations in religion as well as you need to be very good clinicians. So ultimately, therapy drives change because of, or especially in TIIP, because of you being a good role model, right? You know, rather than telling people, oh, I'm a Muslim, you can show them that you're a Muslim. You can show them with your character. And most enduring changes that happens because of the character of people. And that was the example of our Rasulullah. It was the idea that people changed. And you see, one of the classical dilemmas that has been always among the scholars is this. If you have an Islamic government, what kind of things are you going to impose by force? There is no clear answer for that. Because when our Prophet said that leave alcohol, the Sahaba, they just left it. He said, the verse has come, be it about hijab or anything else. People just did it. He never actually had to force people. So, the society evolved rather than being imposed. Why was that? That was because of the character, right? So, developing your character as a clinician and as a therapist, that people take an example from that. And on the other side of it, you know, we have been talking about Islamic psychology and other parts. But the idea of shifa has a divine element in it, because shifa comes from Allah, right? It's not just about the idea of recovery. You know, in modern psychology, we don't use the word healing. We say recovery. We cannot say healing. Because healing sounds more spiritual, right? So you always use recovery. But then, shifa is a word which does not have an English equivalent. It does have element of recovery in it, but it also has the element that Allah wants something for you. And Allah wants to make things better for you. That even if a believer goes through sickness or hardship, there is reward in the hereafter. That is a process of still healing, right? You know, a lot of people come to us in the therapy practice that, why am I like this? Why is Allah doing this to me? But the idea is the idea of life being a test. And if you are a good role model as a therapist and people open up to you, it does create some cognitive dissonance in the person. So let's say if a person comes to you and they are extremely secular, nothing to do with religion, but if they see you as a good Muslim, they have this idea that, okay, Muslims can be very professional as well. Oh, he's a Muslim and he's a very good doctor too, right? So that kind of dissonance leads to change. So it's very important to have competency. It's very important to have professionalism. And it's very important also to have this idea that life is not going to end just when we die. We have to be accountable for everything we do in this life. And Professionalism said that the best among you is the one who is best to humanity, is best to others, right? And that others is not just Muslims. Others means every other human being as well. Yeah? So having this sort of an inclusive approach where, and it's beneficial when it comes to TIIP, you know why? Not only are you helping others, but this modality of TIIP helps you in working on your own self. And isn't that what we want? Isn't that like work in progress, you're making yourself better. And because of betterment of self, other people are benefiting as well. So your character is something that others would always see. People don't look at their words, don't think that they will be impressed with words. It's actually your character. So character development is the most important part. And not only developing it for others, as well as the character of our own. That's a very important part of therapy. And this is important, that the TIIP therapist requires a degree of psychospiritual development and has to study the knowledge of the soul and has to have that tazkiyatun-nafs, or the purification of the soul, right? So the idea is knowing that, that's why we talk about the idea of shifa, that seeing themselves as a vessel or medium of healing, and ultimately the healing comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's very common, you find this in neuroscientists or doctors in general, or surgeons, idea of God complex, right? Feel like, yes, I am the one who does this and these surgeries, and people are better because of that. But when you have an idea of Allah and the soul, you know that you're just a medium. And ultimately, all change, all good, all healing, all recovery, it all comes from Allah. That is the idea of humility, that you work on yourself, and it's not always about the others. It's not always about, because of me, this person is doing better in life. No, it's because of Allah, but then you served a purpose in the process. You were instrumental in that change, but that change only and the reform only comes from Allah. And some of the competencies that we look at when it comes to being a therapist in TIIP is having a very strong foundational knowledge and skills for further improvement, okay? Having strong ethical principles and having relational qualities with strong ability to develop therapeutic alliance, and this is just the details of that, okay? Flexibility in the process of treatment and case conceptualization. You seek out mentors, collaborators, consultants, supervisors for continuous support, and desire to model perfection in character. And that's why study of the seerah is extremely important.
Can it be concluded that a clinician, be it Islamic or non-Islamic, but he is a person of high character, would have a better impact on his client?
If a person is known to have very good character,
Yes.
be it Islamic or not, yes, character has a huge thing to do with driving the outcomes. And by the way, a lot of the things that happen in psychology or in the medical science, it has a lot to do with placebo effect, right? So, one of the things, if the person is known to be good as a character, you are more likely to be approached by people because they have heard good things about you. So character in general is a huge driving force. By the way, how many of us, we go to the doctors and we know that this doctor gives us time, or is somebody who is known to be upright, is very honest, and it actually leads to better outcomes, right? It actually leads to better outcomes in the sense that and that's why I said about placebo. Because you know somebody to be good in character and you go to them and you believe that I will find healing or I'll get better, you actually tend to get better. Placebo has something to do with it, but actually ultimately it's the change that happens and it works. But in terms of religion specifically in TIIP, it is actually just like when you're a therapist, you have these continuous credit hours of study, right? After you become a therapist, you have to have these CE hours every year to renew your licensure. So imagine for TIIP, it's continuous renewal of your inner self, like sitting with the spiritual mentors and doing all these other things so that you are spiritually better, and that would be something that might be helpful in overall helping the other people out there. That answers. So, anyone else having any questions? Yes?
Actually, I went through your Insta empathy in action which you had taken.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have questions on empathy. Like I see empathy as my strength, one of my strengths, but it gets overwhelming at times.
Right.
So how, as a counselor, would I be used?
Right. So the question is that empathy becomes overwhelming at times. So as a counselor, what do you do about it? You see the idea, the classic idea, wear your own safety mask if the air pressure decreases before trying to help others. And there is a reason for that. When you're in the plane, if it goes beyond certain cabin pressure, all these masks come out. Nobody has ever seen it. It has never happened to me and to any one of you. But what is the idea there? The idea is if the cabin pressure is low, you try to help other people, you will start fainting because of low air pressure. So once you put on the mask, your oxygen levels are fine, you can help other people. Same is when it comes to empathy. Now here's the part. How many of you are practicing therapy or seeing clients like you? Many of you, right? How many times it happens that you're sitting in your room, you do a few sessions, you come back and you're like, I am so tired. This was so draining. How can I do this? Right? And the reason for that is this. Our human brain is 2% of body mass. That's at 75 kgs, let's say. Brain would be around 1.6, 1.7 kgs, 2% of body mass. It consumes 20% of energy of the human body. Remember. So, what's the first part? How do you conserve that energy? And empathy takes a lot of energy out of you as well. So, if you are giving, let's say because you are giving empathy, and let's say there is this box and this is empathy, and you are just pouring it upon others. What is the mechanism to refill it back for you? That's the important question you need to ask yourself. And this is what clinicians need to balance. The idea is not how many sessions can you do, how much empathy you need. You can do a lot so far as you have more than you spent. If you have spent more empathy or any other emotion and you don't have much of it left, you cannot help others, that leads to burnout. So that's the same idea in that program I did in our university about empathy in action, was the idea that how do you make mechanisms, for example, connecting with Allah and spirituality is a huge protective factor for us. It is something that gives us back. You know, it's like we are like this huge tree and the water to it is our spirituality, right? So ask yourself, if you are being overwhelmed with empathy, after how long? Because you know, this is what you call as introspection, right? What do? How many sessions can I really do? How many people can I see today? And what am I doing to get my internal resources back? For me, it's spirituality, spending time with my family, traveling a lot, okay? So remember, psychotherapy is not like doing any other job. It can be extremely tiring, okay? So remember to have very strong plans for caring for yourself. And I say caring for yourself as a part of compassion to ourselves. Because one of the ideas when we talk about maqasid al-sharia is hifz al-aql, protection of aql. And it's not only about, you know, classically they give example of alcohol, right? Alcohol is haram because it covers the aql, it compromises aql, so it's haram. Hifz al-aql is also protecting your mental health. It's also protecting your emotions. Hifz al-aql is also protecting your inner resources, that you don't end up being irritated about every single thing, right? Why do we feel so irritated sometimes, right? Why? Because we have spent all our emotions, and then how do we get them back? So ask yourself, what are your mechanisms? And you need to have those mechanisms in place, okay? And That's why I say it's a part of rahmah, it's a part of compassion towards yourself. And Allah says your body has rights over you, so take care of that. But at the same time, I have problems with the idea of self-care. Yeah. You know, because I say self-compassion. Think of it like this, and this is a personal opinion, you don't have to agree with this. Therapists are hell-bent upon self-care, self-care, self-care. Modern therapy has become so narcissistic. It's also about me, my care, myself, my confidence, all about one single person. That's narcissism. And self-care, when we say in modern therapy, in the secular version, it's something like this. I work 5 days in a capitalistic society, which is killing me, it's killing my soul, it's killing my ethics, it's killing everything that is good inside of me. And because I work this hard now, so I have to have a coping mechanism in the weekends, in the 2 days. So I go out party, I will drink, I will do everything what pleases me. That would be self-care. Self-care is not a coping mechanism. And this is how modern psychology tries to prove it. You know, do all of these things for 5 days, then 2 days they are free, you can do whatever. That is your self-care, you deserve it. Do these capitalistic things, these face masks, and go to these spas and spend the money, and this is self-care. No, it's not. It can be something like spending time with yourself. It can be something like spending time with your family because of Sinatul Rahmi, because it's connected to your hereafter as well. Not something which is divorced from it, because there is a life which is yet to come. So keep that in mind as well, inshallah. So any other questions? Yes?
Could you take that session empathy and action online?
I'm sorry?
Request for session empathy and action online.
Oh, I can do that online as well. Yes, inshallah. Why not? We can organize that. I still have the program with me. I did it for the bachelor students in our university. Some of them were, I think, bachelors and masters. It was a nice program. Inshallah, we can do that again.
I could see it was really.
Right, because we talked about some of the competencies and some of the gaps. And by the way, not just in India, you will see it everywhere. When you become a therapist or you want to become a therapist, there are many gaps in education. Many things when you start seeing people, you are not taught them in your textbooks, or your school does not teach you those things, right? So how do you fill those gaps? For example, in our university, apart from the degree, you have a competency scale. So how competent are you in communication? Because it's not only about degree. If you're not able to communicate with your patient or client, you're not going to have good client outcomes. So how do you develop those competencies while you're a counselor or a therapist? I think that's also very important, and that can be talked about. Because I'm going back to Turkey, most of the sessions I keep doing are inshallah online. So if you are in touch with my social media, please reach out and I'll be more than happy to do that.
So as human beings, we influence each other,
Yes.
right? Now, if a client has an influence on you,
Yes.
what are some of the ways that you detract from the influence, knowing that you have to go back and see the client?
Right. Now, the idea of counter-transference, right? Now it depends, right? You see, there is always this idea that your clients generally would fancy you, right? But because you are the professional one here, so what you need to do is you need to enforce those boundaries, right? But now the idea is when you say counter-transference, right? It can be many ways. Let's say, if you had a difficult childhood, let's say, or I had a difficult father, and your client has the same way, and it always makes you remember that. Yeah, that is a part of counter-transference, right? What do you do about it? Couple of ways to go around. One is having supervision. Once you do supervision, you will straighten out your own thought processes. Okay? And then there is the idea of referring people to others. But I'm saying it from a general psychological perspective. Remember this. Referring your patient or client to someone else should be the last thing that you ever do. Unless the client says, oh, I really feel I'm in love with you, or you feel that they're getting dependent, that's a different story. But generally the idea is, if something triggers you, and Jung said this, whatever irritates you about others tells you more about yourself. This is why you need supervision. Because your supervisor will tell you, and self-therapy tells you your biases that are there. So look, Freud was of the idea that you have to be like a blank slate to your client. Classic psychoanalysts, you will find them more in France than Germany. Okay? So classic psychoanalysts work like this. It's very interesting. They have a couch and they sit on the other side of the couch. It's very rare, by the way. You wouldn't see it generally. Normal psychoanalysts today, they call themselves psychodynamic analysts. Psychodynamic means face to face. But if it's a classic psychoanalyst, they have a couch, you lie down, they sit on the other side. You don't get to see their face, they don't get to see you. And in the whole session, they will say maybe one word or a sentence. It works like that. Right? So, that was the idea that why? Because you should not be influenced or your client should not be influenced by you. But modern psychology doesn't believe in that. Human beings always affect one another. But you have to ask yourself, is my client affecting me in a manner that is harmful or that is making me not focus on the goals and the therapeutic alliance we have? So for example, in the training I gave example of one client that I terminated the therapy with. It was a diagnosis of borderline narcissism. And they would just press all your buttons until they bring the worst out of you, right? And you don't want to be in that situation, yeah? So that would be, but that's something very rare that happens. But yeah, ultimately I believe towards your question, supervision really helps, self-therapy helps. Because whatever blind spots you have, you get to work on those. And once you have worked on your blind spots, you can work with a lot of or huge numbers of populations. And by the way, let me also address something else because this is important. How many of you have, because this idea of homosexuality, right? Something very common you see even in Muslim societies. Especially therapists see the society very close because generally people who have distrust, they come to us, right? Now the idea is, that even though it's very common, it happens a lot, what do you do? And while I was having this empathy in action program, because this reminded me of this example, so the students were like, all of them, or generally the ones who are religious, they were like, you know what, it's against Islam, so I'm going to refer the person to someone else, right? And I am not really in that favor. As a clinician who is also a Muslim, and I'm a traditional Orthodox Muslim, but I don't think that's the right way to do. I said, if every Muslim starts thinking like you, where are these people going to go? So again, role models, and the other idea, the people that I have seen struggling with, let's say, homosexuality and stuff, they are not the people who have acted upon on this, but they were like, we are sharing this with you and we have never ever shared this before with anyone else. So you see what I'm trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that we have so many things and people around us, they have so many struggles. And sometimes therapist is the only person they have that they can talk to. So we have to be, rather than having our own biases, because sometimes you say, oh, I have just referred the person to someone else. This is allowed and that's not. We need to have a bigger capacity, right? There is this Islamic principle, and I always say this to younger therapists. The Islamic principle is this: how do you know if you're in a forest or wherever, you're in wilderness? How do you know if the water is clean to make wudu with? There are different ideas. One is like it has to be flowing, then it's okay. It has to have certain characteristics. But there is a general principle. Okay? The general principle is this: if you displace the water on the one end and it doesn't reach the other end, the ripples, it's considered pure, even if it's stagnant. Because the reason for that is the body of water is huge. Okay? So instead of, and if the water body is this huge, even if something which is najis goes into it, it's still considered pure. Okay? So if there is a drop of urine or a bottle of urine, it goes in a huge body of water, water is still considered pure. But if the same thing falls, let's say in something of this capacity, it's impure. So what does it mean? It means rather than focusing on the bad of the people, increase the capacity for goodness. So once you increase the capacity for goodness, the bad things start disappearing. So if you have a huge capacity as a therapist to include people with whoever they are, with all their sins, with all their problems, with whatever they come up with, it's going to be alright. It's fine. increase that capacity for good. Because the world, especially Muslim world, we need very good role models. Why do you think? You see, one of the problems that I personally feel is in the Muslim world, we have lack of good role models. And we need, as human beings, good role models to follow. So therapists, if we are excellent role models, trust me, it can drive a lot of change. And that's what our tradition has always told us, that we are all struggling, you know. Every son of Adam sins, but the best ones are those who repent. And we never know the future which Allah knows. Those we see sinning today, tomorrow they can be way better Muslims than we are. How do we know somebody's end? And how do we know how we are going to end? We can just pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah makes, and which is why the classic Islamic scholars always mention this. Doing good is not a big deal. You know, sawab, doing of the good. Carrying these deeds until you die to the grave, that's the big thing, because you can do a lot of things which will burn your goodnesses, right? Envy, jealousy, diseases of heart, they eat away the good things. Like Professionalism said that the hasad eats the heart like the dry food is eaten by the fire. So carrying it until there, having that capacity. So I think as therapists, as clinicians, we need that. So yeah, I know it was a long answer to your question, but that's a general idea of what I want to say. Yes, and then I will do this.
What are your thoughts on improving self-efficacy as a therapist?
Right. Improving self-efficacy as a therapist. I think self-efficacy is a process, it increases over time. Over time it increases, but your efficacy will come. And by the way, those of you who don't know what is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is, okay, let me give you an example. Let's say you have an exam tomorrow, okay? And you study, exam is tomorrow morning, and you started preparing tonight. And you know for sure that you will be able to cover that all syllabus because you know yourself. You can do it last minute, you're smart enough. This is called high self-efficacy. Knowing that you will be able to do the tasks in the specific amount of time that you have is self-efficacy, right? How efficient you feel about yourself. Because we all have an idea. I'm not going to do this last minute because I know I always forget. Let me do it before. It's a part of self-efficacy. So as a therapist, increase of self-efficacy happens over time. It's a process. But essential parts of it are, therapy is a profession which you have to always keep studying. New things, new researches keep coming up. Always working on that. Working on yourself continuously. You know, all your biases. And one of the great things which helps therapists is, okay, you have progress notes. Progress notes are the notes which you make for the patient, right? And tomorrow if the court summons you or something else, or insurance companies, you have to submit those progress notes. But then there are psychotherapy notes. Psychotherapy notes are personal notes. Like, what do you feel about this client? How was your day today? After having this hard day, how did you feel? You journal that. Journaling helps a lot in increasing your self-efficacy. Because you overgo your cases and start thinking that what could I have done better? Or what did not go right? So I think that's another way. But having a very good supervisor, I think, is the most important one. So reading, journaling, and having an excellent supervisor. So having good supervisors, and not just one. You actually need more than a single supervisor. And ultimately, when they help you with your cases, they help you with your self-therapy and discovery. And if you have a good spiritual mentor, those are the things that really help you in having this confidence, ultimately. Okay? That answers. Yes, sister.
I'm a school counselor, and I see a lot of homosexuality cases coming up to me. Students are adolescents, they are confused.
Yes.
So if the client is Muslim, it becomes easier for me to maneuver. But
Yes.
what if the client is a non-Muslim?
Right.
Then there comes the question, they start judging if I'm homophobic or I'm promoting say homosexuality.
Right.
So I'm always caught up in this dilemma. So how do you handle a client who is non-Muslim, and how do you take it forward?
Right. So if it's a client who's a non-Muslim, who doesn't believe in the Islamic tradition, and the case is for the homosexuality, right? Now there are a couple of ways to look at it. First of all, definitions are very important, right? Homosexuality is orientation towards the same gender, liking the same gender. Sodomy is the act of doing it with the same gender, okay? Sometimes we confuse the two. Homosexuality is just the orientation, it's not the act itself. So far as it's only orientation and the person has not acted upon it, they are not held responsible. So, with your non-Muslim clients as well, or if they are adolescents, you can know to what extent is it happening and what is the reason for that, right? So, reason would mean that you feel like you have this tendency, right? And this is same for Muslims and non-Muslims. And different people have different tendencies. And studies have shown that it's very clear, because I know Muslims have different perspectives about it. Studies tell us clearly that if a person is attracted to the same gender, you're generally born with it. Okay? How many of us, I believe all of us or most of us would be straight in our orientation. Imagine waking up one day and thinking that I like the same gender. It doesn't happen, right? Like you wake up one day and you're like, I don't like girls anymore. I'll be like, I like guys. It doesn't happen. It's a huge thing, right? And it's a huge burden as well. But here's the part. It's a test. Just because I have inclination towards something or I have a drive, it doesn't mean I have to follow it through. A lot of people are kleptomaniac, they want to steal things. A lot of people are pyromaniac, they want to burn down different things. But it doesn't mean you end up acting like that. People who are diabetic, the biggest challenge for them is to control the appetite for eating sugary things. Right? So the impulse is there that you want to eat something sweet, but you know that you have to control it. You cannot go with it. So, Muslim or non-Muslim, this can help us in giving a perspective to people just because you have an impulse and I understand it's there. So first, if they come to you and say this, which means they feel safe with you. Which means you have established safety. When people come to me, people who have homosexual tendencies, it's not the first thing they tell me. They want to test you first if they can trust you, right? So if somebody has come to you or you see these young people, Muslims or non-Muslims, which means they can trust you. That's the first step. And then the idea is, even if the impulse is there for whatever reason, doesn't mean it needs to be followed through, you see. So creating that insight, if you do that and if you go ahead with it, what is going to happen? For example, let's say majority of the HIV cases are actually caused by homosexuality, it's not caused by straight sex. So this example can be true for non-Muslims as well. It's not only something that applies to Muslims, right? So similarly, creating this insight, what is going to happen down the line 10, 20 years if you continue on this path? So I think creating insight and asking questions without judging the person, I think that helps a long way. That the person knows that they have someone that they can talk to. Yeah? So I think you might try that and that might help. But ultimately it depends on case-to-case basis. But I tell you something else here as well. You can do your best, but it doesn't mean that you always have the desired outcome. Right? I had this client of mine, long time back when I started, thank you so much. In an abusive relationship, Muslim, had a boyfriend, not in India, somewhere else. And we worked a lot in therapy about get out without abusive relationship and follow your path, study medicine that she was studying. So, okay, no longer therapy. We did not finish, but there were some sessions that they go their own way and I have no idea what happened then. Suddenly after 3 months or 4 months, I get a text. I said, what happened? I'm pregnant. Why? Oh, I went back to the same guy. And it really made me angry. Okay? I was like, then why did we need to, no, it's not that I said something, but I was like, why did we have to work so hard in therapy? And how could you, back in my mind, I was thinking, how could you be so gullible and stupid? Like, I told you, don't do this, and it was bad for you, we created this insight, I can't say all these things, right? I was angry. Then I go to the supervisor, right? What happened? I said, this happened, and I'm really upset about it. My supervisor goes like, it's not about you, it's about the other person. Why are you taking it so personally, right? So it doesn't have anything. So you see, sometimes we make things about ourselves, and we think it has something to do with us, and ultimately we're accountable for ourselves, while trying best to help others with kindness, not judging them. But trust me, the outcomes that we want as clinicians, we don't always have them. So do your best, try to create these inspiring examples, and even if it doesn't happen, will of Allah. You don't have to blame yourself for it or beat yourself for it. Okay? That helps. Yes, in the front, and then I'll take this question. Yes.
How do we integrate Islamic principles in the therapy without making the client feel burden of imposing the so-called orthodox beliefs on them?
That's a very good question. That how do we integrate Islamic therapy without making the person feel that we are not actually imposing it? So generally when it happens in TIIP, so for example, Dr. Ummeed is a TIIP practitioner. You have to fill a questionnaire first, and that's the only therapy he does. So you know beforehand, going to the therapist, that Khalil Center practices TIIP. Right? So if you're going there, you already know that you're expecting Islamic therapy. That's one way. But in my case, I do both ways. I do TIIP and I do other modalities as well, right? So how does it work? If I see there's an inclination in the person towards religion and towards finding the answers from the religious perspective, right? So for example, people, let's say, people who are abused by religious authorities or religious people, they have this negative view of religion, right? So then you try to work on where it exactly started. Was it Islam religion as itself, or was it certain people, right? And then when they start having this insight that they can distinguish between the two, or somebody breaking up in their relationship and suddenly you start getting closer to Allah, right? That happens a lot. And these are some of the cues which the clients give you, right? And then you ask them, right, what do you think about Islam or your religion? You believe that you're a Muslim. Might have some answers to us that would you be interested in that. So in TIIP as well, by the way, there is no specific instruction or a specific sheikh or a form of religion or specific azkar you give people to read. No. You just tell them that main idea is that we have an afterlife as well. And what are we doing about that? So therapy is not about, you cannot impose your values, and it means like this, and I think we talked in the training part. Let's say a Muslim comes to you or a client comes to you. They have problems with alcohol. They drink alcohol, but then they come to you for, job stress. So your idea is only to work on the job stress, not the part of alcohol. Unless you can prove that alcohol drinking of them has something to do with their job. Maybe the person says, I drink wine in the weekends, it's fine, it makes me relax, it's good for the heart. But 5 days a week I have so much, work to do. So you work on that and you're not accountable for the other part. So if the person needs help in something, but if this person is a Muslim, let's say, and the person wants TIIP to happen, then you will say that, okay, alcohol has, even though it might be good the way you drink it, but it has something to do with your hereafter, which is bad, and we take that into consideration. So it depends on case-to-case basis, okay? So imposing would be like looking down upon the other person, And Al-Ghazali says this. Ghazali mentioned in Ihya that this idea that if the person is telling something good from religion to the other person, and while saying this they feel they are better than the other person, that is when their iman is really in danger. So as TIIP practitioners, you always have to have these checks and balances, that you're not better than the other person, it's just that they are in different circumstances. So always be mindful of not getting, by the way, generally in therapy as well, do not get ahead of yourself in therapy. Only how much the person needs at that point of time, give that. And that comes with time as well. Okay? Anyone else? Yes?
After having done these computer degrees, becoming clinical psychologist, are there any courses or modules where you can become a psychologist?
I'm sorry, courses or modules?
To become an Islamic psychologist.
To become an Islamic
Yeah, and where you get a TIIP certification. Like we become psychologists or clinical psychologists. But in order to have it within ourselves that we are certified, we are doing a
So after you become, after you have a degree in psychology, where do you study more about Islamic psychology and get certified? Is that the question, right? So, for example, in the case of TIIP, and why, like I said, Islamic psychology has many branches, okay? TIIP is the only evidence-based branch, which means recently APA published a paper of an outcome study that how TIIP works, okay? So if you say I'm generally practicing Islamic psychology, there might be the question of, is it evidence-based practice? So TIIP is evidence-based practice. And what do you do? I think that was the whole idea of me being here, is ultimately that there are two levels of TIIP, TIIP 1 and 2, and then there is a supervision part, and inshallah, next year we're trying to bring that to India. Okay? So you take the two levels first, level 1, then you take level 2, and then you go with the supervision, which around takes, the whole thing takes around a year, and then you're certified in this. But while you get certified in TIIP, you also need to have a licensure wherever you work. So if you work in India, you need to be RCA certified, you work somewhere else, you need that. But this will be something that, apart from your degree, and which I always argue, TIIP makes you culturally much more competent to work with Muslims. Not only because you are a Muslim, but it tells you about so much of the value that the Muslim scholars have brought to psychology, and that creates a sense of a very strong identity, both for yourself as well as for your client. So I have seen better outcomes of working with people using TIIP than not using it, especially when it comes to Muslim population. So there are trainings. Qatar recently, Hamad bin Khalifa University launched a master's. It's full on scholarship if you get selected. Master's in Islamic psychology, and that master's in Islamic psychology has an orientation of TIIP because the department is headed by Dr. Ummeed. So if you study there, so you will have a master's degree. And ultimately the idea of Islamic psychology, the way I see it, is that it's also getting into the direction of getting a licensure based on, like, let's say you're a TIIP therapeutic practitioner, and Qatar might recognize you, for example, because you have the different education and you can start practicing after having that master's degree. So it's going in that direction. So apart from your normal degree, even if you are studying religion, you are studying Islamic psychology, that has a lot of scope in the sense that people would love to see more Muslims in the field who are working in the field of it. I hope that answers, okay? Dr. Sir.
We have discussed this in person, but I think it's for the benefit of the audience, and I want to ask you the same question. You remember we discussed about how Islamic psychology, not necessarily coming to the full level of clinician and as a therapist, but then community mentors and other individuals who are active in the society. How Islamic psychology is going to empower them, how it's going to be useful, recognition, referral, as well as intervention at that level. Could you please throw some light on that?
We discussed that in person, and thank you so much for this question. How many of you here are not practicing psychologists? Like not practicing or seeing clients and those who are not. And how many of you would actually want to make a difference to the society by working with people? Right? Perfect. And this question often gets asked. I think recently somebody told me, I think we were talking about in the training, that how can I go back to school now at this age, start studying psychology, then become an Islamic psychologist, etc. What do we do? First of all, I believe community psychology is very important, because as Muslims we don't believe in individualism. Western psychology is very individualistic, right? And I give this example, like when I do consultations in Kashmir, right? Every 2 months, every year, I am in my hometown in Kashmir. So I do these consulting sessions for half an hour. So the persons come and they ask for their problems. But whenever it's supposed to be a single person, it's actually the whole family that comes. So we have like a huge amount of furniture, it's 5-6 people. And then they tell about the person, and I tell them, can you please go out of the room, I want to talk to the person alone. Like, everybody has a say, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us individual psychology works best with Western people because they're individualists at the end of the day. Like human being is supreme. For us, it doesn't work. You know why? Let's say a person made a lot of progress with you in therapy, but then they go back to the same family to live with who is toxic, right? I'm not saying it wouldn't help, therapy still helps, but then the problem is still there. But if you're working like with my clients who are not Muslims, who are in the Europe or North America, you tell them, okay, they cut off with their family, they're like, no, this person is toxic, I don't want to talk to them for the rest of my life. Like this idea doesn't sit well with the Muslims, right? So we are people of the community. So back to the question, more than individual psychotherapists, we need community interventions. And that includes two huge things. Mental health awareness, that's the first part. And second one would actually be after mental health awareness that we have, we need psychoeducation, what we call as an intervention. So mental health awareness would be like, why is mental health important? How does our religion emphasize mental health? Why we need to be of sound mental health in order to be productive members of the society. Okay? So that awareness. And psychoeducation is more about, for example, learning why people kill themselves, learning about suicide, learning about mental health first aid, the symptoms of different mental health conditions. And both of these are extremely needed in the community. Mental health awareness is needed and we need psychoeducation. And both of these can be done by non-psychologists. Both of these. You don't have to be qualified as a psychologist, but there are checks and balances. For example, there is a training in mental health first aid, for example. Suicide from the Islamic perspective, we can train imams, we can train community leaders, and then when we go out with this, so in terms of our mental health scenario, especially in the Muslim world, India or beyond, we need a lot of helping hands, a lot. You know, in India, Muslims, non-Muslims all together, we have one mental health practitioner for 500,000 people. And if you only get the Muslim ratio, it would be way higher. Right? When it comes to clinical psychology, when it comes to practitioners, we have 500,000 people for one mental health practitioner. Now imagine how many mental health practitioners do we need? And that gap is huge. But not only do we need psychotherapists, we need mental health first aid, we need suicide gatekeepers, and we need awareness in general. And you don't need to be psychologists for that. So inshallah, what we are trying to do is introduce courses on mental health first aid from an Islamic perspective, suicide from an Islamic perspective, so that we can train community leaders, we can train people who have influence and everyone, and then that word can be spread. Because ultimately when we are doing well in terms of our mental health, we will be way more productive members of our community and contribute at large, inshallah. Okay? So any other questions? Yes?
Alright, I actually had two questions. One was, how do we deal with clients that come that have experienced child sexual assault, CSA, or just sexual assault, and clients who have experienced religious trauma or like parental neglect at a very young age, and then later it's reiterated by religious teachers that your parents are everything, and if you're unkind to them, then you end up in hell. So that just drives them away from religion. So how do you
And by the way, this is something very common which happens, because there is the idea of people who are also abused by religious figures, and they grow up with the negative view of Islam, right? And it's very interesting. Imagine how genius Imam Ghazali was. Imam Ghazali talks about people who are directly not mukallaf, or he talks about people who are non-Muslims. And he talks about Allah knows best what He would do with people who have not accepted Islam because it never came to them. Okay? So that's one category. But he mentions a special category. He says Allah will also forgive those, or their condition is with Allah. Allah knows best about the people who grew up with a very negative view of Islam. Right? Like in today's world. It could be non-Muslims or see Muslims doing what they do, and they have this negative view. And Imam Ghazali says that, they are not directly considered kuffar. The idea is Allah will know best what to do with them, but it's not by default. But I believe it also includes the Muslims who have a negative view of religion because of the abuse that they suffer. First of all, if you are a Muslim practitioner, the first thing that happens, and I have seen this happening, and I've discussed with other Muslim practitioners, cognitive dissonance. They have this idea that Muslims are evil. they are bad, especially those who are religious, right? But when they really start talking with Muslims or a Muslim practitioner, they start realizing that maybe not all Muslims are like that. Maybe it was the people, which is why being a good role model is important in TIIP. Because they had negative view of practicing Muslims. Now you are a practicing Muslim, or mashallah you are wearing hijab, or brothers having their beard or praying on time, etc. Not everybody is like that. This person listens to me. That is the start. Being a good role model. And ultimately, if they have grown up with this image, or there was sexual abuse as children, establishment of safety. Now, the idea is this. What do I mean by establishment of safety? It means this. Initially, if the person feels safe with you, people don't just come in the first session, and I said it in the training as well. People want people live on their intake forms, right? Because they want to know, I can trust this stranger, right? But after the trust is established, and how many cases, I've seen a lot of cases of child sexual abuse, but it's never in the first or the second session. It's after 10th, 15th session they said something like this happened. Including men, by the way, not just females. Including men talking about their experiences and what do we do about this. So first, being a good role model. And secondly, validating that experience that what happened was not your fault. Okay? And generally in terms of trauma, I ask 3 questions. Okay? And I tell the clients to write them down for me, and I want you to work on these even if you take your time. The first question, what is lost? Okay? You ask them, I lost my innocence. I lost my dignity. I lost the love for myself. I feel guilty. I feel ashamed of myself. Right? What is lost? And they journal about it. Second question is, what is left? And this works very good in conflict resolution and disaster management as well, right? So for example, let's say an earthquake happens, you ask the people what is lost, they will be like everything. It's ultimately only the house is lost, but the answer will be everything is lost, right? But when you say what is left is about creating this insight in the people with trauma or people who have lost something. Okay, you lost your house, or you lost that innocence to talk about. What is left? And the biggest thing you have left is your alive, your knowledge, your resources, maybe you have a good friend, maybe anything else. So then you make a list of these factors of what is left. And then the third and most important question is, what are you going to do with what is left? Right? And that takes a while. Like you go back and forth on this, right? You keep adding to this. So the idea is what is lost and what is left, right? So many people will say, for example, I lost a lot of my years to addiction, right? I lost a lot of my years to anger, to resentment, to things doing I didn't want to do. I was abused repeatedly for so many years. What about it? Where is the justice, right? So, or even where was Allah's justice at that time? It's a very common thing. But what is it? It's not that they are saying Allah is unjust. It's that they are angry, right? So, how do you, and because this anger is directed inward, it becomes maladaptive, right? So anger itself is not a negative emotion, okay? But when it's driven inward, it becomes maladaptive, right? So going emotionally, like asking these 3 questions, what is lost, what is left, what are you going to do with what is left? And then a lot of emotion processing. So in trauma, in my personal opinion, emotion-focused therapy works the best, okay? So when you use EFT, emotion-focused therapy, especially with people with trauma, they are able to consolidate this idea that what happened to them has happened. It cannot be changed. But there are still things they can change about their life. You see, when people say everything is lost, they are actually saying that it's the loss of what you call a sense of agency. It's the loss of autonomy. But once you tell them you still have sense of agency, you still have your human autonomy, what ends up happening is they start feeling empowered. And that's the idea of therapy. The idea of therapy is to empower the person so that they are not dependent on the therapist. They can make their own moves and work on their own. So once you go in this direction, and then time to time you see those checks and balances if it's working. That answer is okay.
But if we look at it through TIIP,
Right.
and say they've heard statements like this was a test from Allah, so how do you tackle that?
Who says? The therapist, or I wouldn't say the therapist.
From like the environment that they've been in. It could be a parent, it could be like a friend or a religious teacher.
Right. But here's the idea. Everything is a test from Allah. So here's the part. If we look at it, because we only think that negative things are a test of Allah. Poverty is a test. Sickness is a test of Allah. Right? Sexual abuse is a test from Allah. No. Health is also a test from Allah. Right? Happiness is also a test from Allah. Just like, having money is also a test from Allah. Allah's test is a longitudinal test. It is lifelong. So only singling out is a distortion. If we single out a simple incident, and how we try to do things which help, but they end up creating more damage, this is one of those words. It was a test from Allah. We are living this life, it is a test from Allah, right? No, it's like this idea, I always see this Western people, I went to India, I went to Himalayas, I had such a spiritual experience. Life itself is a spiritual experience. You don't need to go to mountains to discover it and stuff, right? So similarly, when we say test of Allah, every moment is a test of Allah. It cannot be singled out. And this is human tendency, right? Whenever we do good, we attribute it to ourselves. We are successful, I worked so hard. Now because I had a failure in business, because it was the taqdeer of Allah, that's why it happened, right? So that's the human nature of not being willing to take responsibility. And what is the core of therapy? It is making the clients responsible for their actions. Or what happened in the past, let's say in case of sexual abuse, not their fault, but what happens further that has somehow something to do with that. I mean, you can empathize with that, but people are still responsible. And that's what therapy does. So in TIIP as well, if their parents say, this specific thing was a test of Allah, you can tell them as a therapist, all life is a test of Allah. And if it's sexual abuse, it should have never happened in the first place. It's not about, it was Allah's test, right? Just like, somebody dying by suicide, and you say he's in a better place. Because that gives the idea to reach a better place, you have to kill yourself, right? We often say this in grief. Don't worry about it. This person is in a better place because they killed themselves. But the idea that it gives is you have to kill yourself to be at a better place. So no, these are not helpful statements. Okay? So what you try to do is you try to reframe such statements into more affirmative, positive statements. But not in a toxic sense, like they are in a better place, or this was a test from Allah, everything was a test from Allah. But you see how they look at this experience of whatever happened and where they fit in their life and what do they do further from this. So it's a long process, but that is the way it will follow. Okay? Somebody raised their hand. There are no gentlemen asking any questions. None. Did anyone, except Dr. Samil asked me the question.
I have a few more questions.
Please, yes.
Sorry, I have a few more questions that these are coming in online.
Please,
online questions. So the first one, the question is, does these therapists have the same approach to all, let it be professional or personal prospects of life? The therapists, TIIP therapists,
Okay.
do they have the same approach to all patients or clientele? I'm presuming Muslim, non-Muslim.
Oh,
At the same time, whether professional or personal prospects of their life.
right. No, I think if they are specifically talking about TIIP, TIIP works best with the Muslims because there is a worldview behind this. And the worldview is there is an afterlife that is. And that afterlife is how our religion of Islamic mindset. So, can TIIP work with non-Muslims? Yes. How? By being a good role model, it can create that dissonance that how Muslims are and how their experiences are. But going further when it comes to making goals and talking about the hereafter, TIIP practitioners have to be a good role model, and that is universal, not only in therapy practice but in general life as well. That's what is established. But the part where non-Muslims and our worldview, that's very diverse in terms of the interventions. But until the role model contact was.
So the next question is, in TIIP, how do we deal with the clients of drug abuse? I think partially answered that. Especially when they know it's wrong, but they find it very difficult to come out even after several attempts to do so.
Will they come out of the ground?
So in TIIP, what would be the intervention in drug abuse? Although they know it's wrong, very difficult to come out from the ground.
I think from the perspective of TIIP, when it comes to, let's say, when it comes to drug addiction, the first thing where it starts is understanding the other person. Because when we look at the best role model, which is our Prophet Muhammad, what was his way of correcting people? You know, his way of correcting people was then how are we harsh on others, especially those who are considered addicts in the society. But our Prophet had an inclusive way of dealing with things and creating insight among the people. And when this man comes, for instance, and says, like, you know what, I want to commit 3 or 4 occasions. Think about what if somebody does it with your mother or with your sister or others. He says, no, I wouldn't like that. How would you like it for someone else? And that's actually right. I'm not going to do it. That is creating insight, right? So I think when it comes to the interventions again for drug addiction we are talking about, first of all, not judging the person, because we think we know the other person, but we hardly even know our own selves. We barely know ourselves. How much is there to discover about our own self? Think about it. So if we are not complete there in our inward journey, it's very hard to judge the other person of where they are. Maybe you're further ahead in your life in the journey, and the person is way back, or even there in the minus of the timeline, they're in addiction now. We never know how it's going to end up. So in TIIP, first of all, you become the Rafiq because you're more authoritative. Right? You have more power over the client. But when the person feels that they are not judged, okay, and they know what they are doing is wrong, assume that it means they also want to get rid of it. So it's not easy to say, you know what, by doing drugs, just leave them, you'll be all right. It's a process. And we follow through that process. Because if there is a disease, there is a cure as well. So addiction is a problem. In TIIP, what if you create these mechanisms? These mechanisms are stronger than the addiction itself. And I always give this example when it comes to purpose, for example. Let's say if I am standing here and I have a huge, this ball of iron weighing me down. A ball of iron is really weighing me down. Medieval times they used to torture people like this. They couldn't move because it's like a few hundred kgs of iron. Fine. And I cannot move. But what if in front of me there is a magnet which is so strong that it will still keep you moving forward? So your magnet has to be bigger than that iron ball. Which means that even in terms of addiction, it might be a huge iron ball which is keeping you down. You need a magnet, you need a purpose. You need mechanisms of protection or protective factors that are stronger than your addiction. So you don't only work on addiction, because working on addiction would mean this. I have 100 kg of iron ball, break it down, make it 50, 60, right? 40, and then it will be gone. That does not always work because it's very difficult. Because the question would be, why would you want to make that iron ball smaller? But what if there is a magnet which is pushing you? Means there is something more you're looking forward to. And while you're looking forward to it, you know you have to let go of this burden because there is a greater thing which is attracting you. That is the meaning of life, your purpose, your goals, and the life that could be out there. So that is one of the ideas that how addiction can become about. Not only working on the addiction, but what if you were not an addict? Because we start identifying with our conditions, right? I'm a depressive person. He's bipolar, schizophrenic. We don't use these terms. It's a person with a condition of depression. It's not an anxious person, it's a person with anxiety. Do not personalize pathologies. Do not turn pathologies into people. People are more than their pathologies. It's not just an addict, it's a human being with addiction. That's how words are powerful. It's a person with addiction. That means we will start humanizing people and looking at them with mercy. Once we do that, not only we work on the addiction, we also tell these people, if you didn't have this addiction in life, who would you be? What would you like to do? And that is the sort of approach that we would like.
So that was a good answer. The next question, how to choose a particular field of study and how long is the study of Islamic psychology?
Well, that really depends. You already have to be in the practice to be a TIIP practitioner. So you already have to have a licensure wherever you are working, be it clinical, counseling, occupational therapy, etc. And then you do 2 levels of TIIP, generally a week-long training. You take like these couple of weeks, study the books which are recommended, and go for the supervision part. After the supervision, you get certified, but generally the whole process takes around a year.
The question was already asked on the YouTube channel that in the professional setting and the personal setting, how does TIIP generally play out? My question is a little more broader, saying that in a professional setting, the client itself has accepted that help is required, or he knows that he is in need of help. But as a practitioner, you have to diagnose your family members and you're able to figure out these interventions may be required, and you tend to advise them. And then I personally, I advise or tell people that this is the help that you need. They're very repulsive. They're very reluctant to accept help because that undermines their self-efficacy and they believe their competence is questioned, right? And if you didn't tell them the problem, then you're like, don't be a therapist. Don't try to dig deep and make your own theory out of it. So how should you, as a community leader or let's say a member of society, play a role in advising and being able to communicate the issues to people in general?
So you're talking more about how people are responsible to be advised about, given about their mental health. They tell you like you're not a mental health expert, so don't do it.
Yeah, complicating in personal life.
In personal life, right? Right. So, but what about in you mean to say, for example, in people who come into us, they know that they need help. But there are people out there who need help, but don't know that they need help. Is it something like that, along these lines?
Yeah.
Now, here's the point. The way I look at it is the idea that therapy is not just for people who have serious mental health conditions or pathologies. It can also be people who have no mental health condition as such, but they want to unlock new goals in their life, or they want to see what are the barriers there, right? So these people that you're talking about, whatever struggles they have, or you feel that something is not catching up, we have to assess which parts of their life are being affected by this, right? So when you identify the domains which are being affected, rather than saying you need professional help or see a therapist, would you like to work on this domain of your life? Or do you think it can be made better? You know, you can even leave mental health out of it. Or tell them, if this is your behavior, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is the outcome? Wouldn't it make it difficult for other people to live with you? And that especially also, let's say, people with OCD, very particular about happening things. What do you think is going to happen in the coming years that comes? So rather than calling it OCD, tell them whatever condition it is, the way it's affecting your life has become maladaptive. Means it's not serving the purpose. Would you like to make it better? And then they can be referred to the child. Does that answer? Is there something along those lines? Or because the idea is to create an insight in this person. Because look, people are generally repulsive to the idea of change. Human beings resist change. We love our comfort zone. People get offended if it's anything about their mental health. Right? Especially in case of men, because generally mental health from the Muslim perspective in general is thought to be lack of iman. In case of men, it's thought to be lack of strength, weakness, right? So the whole idea here is how not to do that, right? The idea is to tell the person rather than that, oh, because I've often seen people saying this, oh, you need to see a therapist, or I get tagged in these Instagram posts, right? Literally, tag, why don't you see this guy? He needs therapy and stuff. It's as if you're saying that therapy is for people like that who just act in a certain manner, but that's not true, right? So it's for everyone, but at the same time, creating that inside in people.
How would you do that? How would you create that?
Okay, how you create insight in people is like this. You create insight by incentivizing people for certain things. Let's say, community needs support. Muslim community needs volunteers. Why would someone volunteer, right? It's taking out time, it's doing a lot of things. I want to volunteer at the mosque and stuff. You incentivize it by the saying, you're going to learn people's skills, right? And whenever you're looking for a job tomorrow, it might actually be better that you learn it. So you see, you're connecting religion to practical life as well. It creates some insight. But in your case as well, what happens? It depends on the behavior that the person has or the help that they see. So if you try to connect it with what impact it can have on their studies, career, family life, they start getting more of this more. What do we do about it? And one of the things that they can do about is to do the opposite of what they're doing. So for example, some people are extremely introverted. I mean, introversion is not a problem. Extreme introversion is more closer to schizoid personality. Closer to that, like extreme sort of introversion. So what can be done is, why don't you, join some community program? It would be extremely difficult. I can know that. Let me come with you and see how that feels. You know why? Because in today's world, in order to be successful, you would need to interact with people. Things like that. But I'm not saying it's not a guarantee that it's going to work. But the idea is telling the person what is going to happen. Human beings work on something called as negativity bias. Negativity bias means we are attracted more by negative things than positive things, right? News, like a plane was lost or a plane got an accident, it's top news. Thousands of planes reach airports every day safely, nobody talks about negativity bias. Why don't you use it for your advantage? Showing the person not that if you fill this goal, this is the benefit. But if you don't, what do you have to lose? So when human beings have this at the back of the mind that I'm going to lose it, it puts us to action. More than saying that if you do this goal, you will have a good job. If you don't do this, you might end up in a bad job. Nobody wants to end up in a bad job. So that negativity bias, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, a couple more questions, hopefully not long. The next question says, how do you explain the asrar of jinns when behavior changes caused by jinns, which is mentioned in the Quran psychologically? How will you explain this psychologically?
How do we explain the psychology of jinn possession more from a psychological manner, right? The idea is if we talk about religious psychology, I mean, modern psychology, obviously there's nothing like that, it's not a part, but it is a part of our faith. So, how do we explain it? We do believe that jinns are a creation of Allah, and we do believe in jinn possession, and that's why we have the idea of ruqya, right? So when people generally, by the way, in my practices, there are certain mental health conditions which are closer to jinn possession. Examples like DID, dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, sometimes psychosis in general. Yes. So I would recommend people do ruqya, like get it done by a professional doctor, do it, and how do you feel after that? If the symptoms are alleviated or there is a betterment, we will discuss the case in the Mind and Body Hospital. The father is here. He had a great success with one of the patients that was not responding to any of the treatments except for ruqya, right? And I was told that the person's like going to the college, right? That's correct, right? And he did that. So there was no response to antipsychotics or mood stabilizers or psychotherapy, but just ruqya worked. And it does work. And I've seen many other cases in which it works. But here's the point. There are certain diagnoses which you clearly know that it needs therapy, it gets better. Certain ones like psychosis, certain delusions, DID, that can be common with the idea of the jinns. So why not do ruqya as well and see if the things are getting better, if nothing else is working as well. So that it can go hand in hand. But as Muslims, we do believe in there is something like that, and that ruqya helps ultimately. It's not something that I really specialize in. Maybe Brother Fahd can tell us more about it. I don't specialize in that. But at the face of it, what I'll tell you is that it exists, and spiritual intervention in TIIP here, which is ruqya, is also very beneficial and helpful. And that's how we help Muslims.
Just to add on that, Alhamdulillah, we practice here at PDA. We have Brother Jameel.
Is in the back.
We have been regularly exposing our patients to ruqya, and we see that there's a lot of improvement. At the least, and I always tell this to the patients, at the least what we see is there's a greater compliance, even if we are not getting a complete cure, just out of it. So the next question, how do you treat a person who is suspicious about their spouse, despite being Muslim and knowing it's suspicion?
I think one of the diseases of heart is the suspicion of others. It is one of the diseases of heart, and generally spouses have it. I've seen this in couples therapy. What is the light by the way? Okay, then I'm not going to say something. So, alright. So, yeah. Anyways, so what ends up happening is it's a part of paranoia. Now, it can have different bases. Okay? So, when I say it can have different bases, I mean this. If it's rooted in paranoia due to a mental health condition, then it's something that really needs treatment. Some other suspicion is because something happened in the relationship after that the couples couldn't trust each other. They're two different things. So, where is this suspicion coming from? Is it because the trust was broken, or is it because out of nowhere there is this paranoia, right? If it's just paranoia, treatment, whatever is needed, and probing what is causing this paranoia. But if it's suspicion because the trust was broken somehow, then maybe couples therapy or marital therapy can be something like that.
Those are the online questions. Any further questions from audience? No. We have some.
As a therapist, as a sexual therapist, when you're providing or offering therapy to say non-Muslim clients, and say their coping mechanisms are, suppose they're dealing with loneliness, and their coping mechanisms are, say, going on dating apps, meeting a lot of people, or alcohol, and that's healthy in healthy limits. And if you encourage that as a therapist to be on that path of therapy and it's working out for them, are you, as a Muslim, being sinful, or is that going beyond who you are as well? How does that conflict work?
That's a good way of looking at it. Like, how do you reconcile between the two? Between people doing what they do. I think the job of a therapist, in general, I'm not saying from the perspective of TIIP, I'm saying the job of a therapist generally is to reveal to people about who they are and what they feel more authentic about, to be honest, right? You know, they ask Michelangelo, like, how do you make such beautiful sculptures? I said, no, I don't. It's already there. Just bring it out. It's already in the stone. My job is just to bring it out. It's the same way generally I'm saying with therapy, especially when you're seeing people who are not Muslims. In Muslims and TIIP use a different worldview. That's a different story. But generally in therapy, it's about people having an authentic life. And be it with your or without your intervention, they will be following that. They will be. So you are actually not encouraging those behaviors. The person is doing, and here's the part. Why do we say, look, it's a very fine thin line between what is adaptive and maladaptive for us. Right? For Muslims, it's very different. For us, alcohol is maladaptive, no matter what you do. It's how you don't drink alcohol, no matter what happens. But studies can tell you why it has good effects. But the Quran mentions as well, the heart is better than the good. Maybe the person has a very different worldview. They don't believe in our worldview to actually bring them back. Right? So because therapy is a profession which is about the client, it's not about you. So you would not be held accountable. In other ways, look at it. All you have to do is you have to adhere to the principles of the profession that you have. For instance, if you're a lawyer, it is also a criminal's right that they have a counsel to defend them. If the lawyer says, no, I'm not going to do the job because this person has killed someone, or this person is a terrorist, and in India, these controversies keep coming up, right? Like, lawyers refusing to defend someone. Yeah? But the reality is we cannot do that. Everybody has a, for example, if someone is a doctor, they will discriminate on the basis of religion or on the basis of who the person is. They will have to treat, right? So similarly, I'm saying not from the perspective of TIIP in general. Therapy is not about you, it's about the client. If they find that behavior is adaptive, it's their choice in their life. You don't encourage, because in therapy, you don't encourage any behaviors as such. People have their own sense of agency and their own right to making decisions. But if you try to put them away from it, let's say it's a non-Muslim, they drink alcohol, and you tell them no, they would feel like you're imposing your values upon them. So that's not good for therapy.
I would like to do we lost about to manage the non-Muslims. Talking in India, we are still 80% non-Muslims. So, because we have been in practice for more than around 30 years in Bengaluru. One thing I would like to just discuss this into the notice of the house. Like your one question was also about the TIIP being practiced with non-Muslims. Actually, we at Hindus of India are just specifically keeping it to Indian situation. And we have got some lot of common worldview. We are not absolutely diametrically opposite to each other. This one thing we have to change. Then it becomes very easy for us to tackle this thing. Regarding the belief in God, belief in hereafter, belief in the Jannat and Jahannam, the description of Jannah. Because I was brought up in places where I was the only non-Muslim family among non-Muslims. So we have gone through their scriptures in our studies. We have gone through their everything in our school studies. There is a lot of commonality between Islamic view as well as Hindu scriptural views. We take it from Vedas, we take it from Puranas, we take it from epics. So in them also, what is wrong for us is also wrong for them, according to their scriptures. Possibly a little knowledge of it, a cursory knowledge of those things, and giving those examples to take them away from them may be a very good taking of those patients. I think that will be a very good way of it. I think you may have to bring a change, particularly a positive comparative religion study, not a contradictory debating way of thinking. See the commonality between different religions, non-Muslim religions, because the basic of those scriptures are also from only. There is a Quran is the ultimate defined version of what things went wrong. So I think this approach of knowledge of those scriptures and knowledge of those things, and also telling from their scriptures and their morality, it becomes, we can adopt the TIIP views and TIIP technique by quoting their scriptures and their things from professional point of view, not from human point of view. Human point of view, as a practicing therapist or a doctor, only with the tendencies.
No, I agree to some extent. I do agree with that, because ultimately, if we look at the world's religions, the concept of morality, spirituality, afterlife, these are general themes in most of the major world religions. But I think the question, the way I understood it, the way the sister says, also, even if a person is a non-Muslim, but they still don't believe in a religion. Let's say there are more Christians in the world than Muslims are there, but they're not really Christians. It's very hard to say what they are, but they don't believe in the scriptures as well. You see, if they believe in the scripture, well and good. But what if they don't? Because this can make therapists feel very burdened if you start making yourself responsible for the actions of the other person, right? Because therapy is not telling the person to adapt in any maladaptive behaviors. So for example, alcohol, right? It's maladaptive because it's bad for health. Like in smaller quantities, fine. I'm saying from a very secular perspective, or not from a Muslim perspective. But the idea is, if there is a way, any of the things that you find questionable is affecting the person's life, then you go there. Other than that, it's just the person discovers their path and they walk on it. Right or wrong, ultimately when we return to what we have to think. So therapist journey is, they will know that their journey had a witness. No matter what they do, they will still remember you as a person who was there for them. If nothing, even if the person continues drinking, dating, doing anything, they would remember this, that there was a person who knows about their journey and who had not judged them, and who was a Muslim. And I think being remembered as a good role model is at least something that can be done. Right? So I hope that answers that.
Just this final question that was left out. What are the challenges? What challenges can be predicted in the growth of Islamic psychology movement in the extreme Muslim society?
Extreme challenges? Yeah. I think when it comes to the challenges of societies in the Muslim society or the extreme Muslim society, I think one of the challenges that I feel is about when you say Islamic psychology, who speaks for Islam and what Islam is exactly. You see, that's a big question to be asked. You know, one of the brothers mentioned about when I was doing the TIIP training, he said, "Why do you mention the Sufi Sheikh? It doesn't have to be Sufi, it could be." I said, "Yeah, that's fine. But majority of the contributions in the nafs are actually done by Sufis, because Sufis are specific to the nafs of the person. I mean, there are so many people with contribution in Hadith and Quran and others, but why the term Sufi?" So I think one of the big challenges is that when you say Islam, it's a huge umbrella. One of the challenges would be to adopt it in a way that it does not lead to any controversies. I think TIIP does that successfully because it only talks about things which you cannot disagree with if you are a Muslim. It does not have anything controversial. It does not talk about anything specific that you should read this or you should do this azkar or you should follow this scholar. So it doesn't say that. So I think in that manner, TIIP is very good. And another challenge that I find for Islamic psychology, apart from the religion, like which version of Islam, it also has something to do with the Muslim culture, which means that Muslims are not a monolith. We all have different cultures. We don't look the same. We don't dress the same, right? So how do we make it more inclusive, not only in terms of religion, but also the cultural adaptation of that body? So I think that Muslims of Indonesia are very different from Muslims of India and Muslims of Turkey, right? So how do we really make it adaptable to all the regions in the Muslim world? So I think that can be another challenge. And thirdly, and lastly, I would believe that with the Islamic psychology part, the challenge is also, but it's changing now, the challenge would also be how do you make it more systematic and how do you make it more accessible? Because accessibility is an issue. And making it more systematic, like having degrees and licensures in Islamic psychology, I think that is a challenge. And these challenges, I think all of them are being tackled. And we hope, inshallah, that we overcome these challenges.
So before we wrap up, there are a few announcements. Those that have come in walk-in, please leave us a registration form that is sent online. So, sorry. Also, there's a paper circulated. Please fill in your details over there. Those who are online, please connect to us over the link that has been sent. We may be in the WhatsApp group. The second announcement, inshallah, please don't walk away very quickly. There's dinner waiting for every one of us. The third announcement will wrap up with this, then pay shifa. Now I call upon Dr. Rajit, the director of the Center, to give a momentum to the Yaqeen for his time over here.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
the books which are gifted to Yaqeen Sikander are the two books of Sira, which I like and deeply recommend to everybody. They are in Urdu. One is Muhammad Arabi, the other is Jalwai Far. Both are written by Muhammad Inayatullah Asif. So, if you know Urdu, please read these two books of Sira. I would like to thank everybody who turned up. And the audio is better when you are here than online. But the audio is bad. Then I would like to thank our two main representatives from Mind and Brain Hospital, Sister Zulekha and Brother Shuja. Please get people who don't know. They are both Islamic psychologists working in Mind and Brain Hospital. And it's a wonderful hospital. Whoever can have no problem going there or closer to Mind and Brain, please visit them. Thank you. I would like to thank Brother Yaqeen Sikander. Zali was one of the very good psychotherapists of his time. And I am going to explain his condition by quoting Gandhi. उनके देखे से जो आजादी है मुंह पे होना, उनके देखे से जो आजादी है मुंह पे होना, वो समझते हैं कि बीमार था अच्छा. So he was very very sick when he came in. After taking a couple of medicines, he felt better. He was sick. So taking out of a call for Brother Yaqeen Sikander, I would like to thank our Imam Sahab, Tawfiq Ilahi Sahab. What can we do without Dr. Sabri? We are grounded because of him. I am also very thankful to our Rafi here. There is a higher excellent Rafi who comes all the way from Sandra, not Bangalore. Excellent Rafi. Muhammad Jamil Sahab Ummeed. He specializes in Ruqya, and Alhamdulillah we have had extremely good results with Brother Muhammad Jamil Sahab. I would like to thank my younger brother Hamza here, who at the last moment helped us get this particular event online. We don't have to talk to you. Of course, if you miss your wife, greatest honor. So, big thanks to my wife, Dr. Asya. She's a consultant psychiatrist here. All the audience members who have come, please have dinner and go. We'll shortly have Isha prayer. I would like to humbly ask Dr. Wajahat to conclude this event by a short dua. That's all. It will be an honor, please.
Alhamdulillah. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا. رب زد علما رب زدني علما رب زدني علما. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. या अल्लाह हमारे गुनाहों को माफ़ फरमा, या अल्लाह हमारे इस जुड़ने को कबूल फरमा, या अल्लाह जो मकसद के लिए आप जुड़े थे, या अल्लाह उस मकसद को या अल्लाह कामयाब फरमा, वादे पर पहुंचने के लिए रास्तों को आसान फरमा, रुकावटों को दूर फरमा। या अल्लाह इखलास के साथ बहुत बहुत दूर से लोग आए थे, या अल्लाह टीम को कबूल फरमाओ, या अल्लाह टीम को कबूल फरमाओ, या अल्लाह कुछ ना कुछ इंसानियत के लिए अच्छा करना चाहते हैं, या अल्लाह हम सब लोगों के ऊपर इनके चश्मों को खोल दो, या अल्लाह हमारे से या अल्लाह पूरी दुनिया के लिए या अल्लाह एक राहत का काम करने का जरिया फरमाओ, या अल्लाह जिंदगी में हम पढ़ रहे हैं, या अल्लाह इसका इल्म हमें अता फरमाओ, या अल्लाह शिफा तो आप देंगे, या अल्लाह आपके भरोसे के ऊपर इलाज करने की तौफीक अता फरमाओ, या अल्लाह हुज़ूर पाक सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम जितने भी खैर की लगी दुआएं मांगे इसमें हमारा हिस्सा अता फरमाओ, पूरे इंसानियत का हिस्सा फरमाओ, शुरूर आफत बलाया से जो पनाह मांगे उससे हमारी हिफाजत फरमाओ, पूरी इंसानियत की हिफाजत फरमाओ, या अल्लाह पूरे आलम के लिए हिदायत के फैसले अता फरमाओ, आपस में इंसानों में भाईचारगी अता फरमाओ, लड़ाई झगड़ा बदगुमानियाँ, या अल्लाह रूहानी बीमारियाँ, दिमागी बीमारियाँ, जिस्मानी बीमारियों को दूर फरमाओ, उसका करेक्ट इलाज करने का इल्म अता फरमाओ, या अल्लाह रूहानी सेहत, दिमागी सेहत, जिस्मानी सेहत हमें अता फरमाओ, रब्बना तक़ब्बल मिन्ना इन्नका अंतस समीउल अलीम व तब अलैना इन्नका अंतत तव्वाबुर रहीम, सल्लल्लाहु तआला अला खैरि खल्क़िही मुहम्मद व आलिहि व अस्हाबिही अजमईन, सुब्हान रब्बिका रब्बिल इज़्ज़ति अम्मा यसिफून, व सलामुन अलल मुरसलीन, अल्हम्दुलिल्लाहि रब्बिल आलमीन.
People who want to do wudu can go to our ablution area. We'll gather back here for Isha.
Ladies prayer area is going to be the next one. Yes.